I'm Dr. Ted Wogamont. I have a doctorate in clinical psychology, and I'm certified at the highest levels in 3 areas of addiction work: alcohol and drugs, gambling, and sexual addiction. I'm also certified as a master's addiction specialist. I've been in the field of working with addicts for almost 30 years, and I'm happy to make this presentation today and hope that I can extend to you a lot of the knowledge that I've gained over the years. Today I'd like to speak to you about major mental health disorders. If you'll remember, this is one of the 2 pieces that is extremely important, critically important, for full recovery for the addict. The other, of course, is what we've already talked about at some length, which is the 12-step program, including sponsors and so forth. Today, I want to talk about the major mental health disorders that get in the way if they're not attended to. And please remember, if you're going to get help for them, make sure the person is properly certified as an addiction specialist, or otherwise they may not be able to adequately help you recover from this. Now, I want to begin with a mental health disorder that is not listed in your visuals that you receive. And it's called Adult Attention Deficit Disorder. You hear a lot about this disorder these days, but I want to talk about it to begin with because it is prominent among addicts. I've been amazed through the years of how many addicts have this problem and how it has contributed almost to the point of setting the stage, being a precursor for addiction in their life. Now, what I mean by attention deficit disorder is that this happens to have focus on this part of the brain right here, the forehead of the person, which has to do with focus, attention, completion of tasks, short-term memory loss, and impulse control, a braking system. And this is one of the biggest problems for people with ADD because of that lack of braking system, an adequate braking system. It's way too easy for the brain then to go on a kind of search-seek mode, looking for something more interesting, more exciting, more appealing to them, and that often ends up being alcohol, drugs, gambling, and one of the other addictive processes. So I want to talk a bit about that. First of all, ADD is caused by the lack of 2 neurochemicals which affect this frontal lobe part of the brain. Now, this part of the brain is the last part to develop for human beings. For males, that development lasts until age 25 or 26. Now, the 2 neurochemicals involved are once again dopamine. See how prominent that chemical is. And secondly, one called norepinephrine, which is a stimulant, a neurochemical, and the idea is for it to wake up this part of the brain. If the brain is not getting enough of those 2 chemicals, then, as I was saying before, the search-seek mode begins. They have trouble focusing, paying attention, and it causes a lot of problems in terms of their self-esteem. They feel like they're different from other people. They're often put down by teachers or coaches or somebody in a position of authority. And so it's very disabling in many, many ways. A couple of examples of this that I've heard from clients. I had one client tell me that he said, "Doc, my brain is like it's always being surrounded by like 50 TV sets, each one on a different channel at the same time." If you can picture that, it's an incredibly graphic presentation of it. Another person told me that their brain is like a hot rod car with a great engine, and little tiny breaks. Still another person told me that their experience was, particularly like in school, they just couldn't pay attention, they couldn't stay focused, they always felt like they were behind, they were stupid as a consequence of that, and so forth. I had one client also who was a college student. He was a golfer, and he came to see me not because there was any problem with school, but because he said he couldn't anymore focus on hitting the ball, and it caused him significant problems. I then asked him about, well, how are you doing in class? And he said, oh, I can't stay focused in those classes. I don't really care about that. I want this golf issue taken care of. We got him on the appropriate medication. He came back and I said, how's it going? He said, best front nine of my entire life. And Doc, he said, I can actually sit through a full class now. Never was able to do that before. But I hope you can see how easily, if you have that problem, how easily that sets the stage for addiction entering into the scene. So, in recovery then, you really need to have this mental health disorder attended to. And once again, remember that it should be somebody who understands addiction, because the two chemicals most usually used to handle attention deficit disorder are Ritalin and Adderall, and both of them can lead people right back into their addictive behavior. I don't know how many clients told me, all it does is make me want to drink more, that kind of thing. So, anyway, with that said, let's now look at some of the other mental health disorders that are prominent. So we have 4 mental health disorders that we're going to talk about after attention deficit, and these are depression, anxiety, trauma is a huge one, and personality disorders. So let's begin by talking about the mental health disorder called depression. And here are some quotes from different people about their experience of depression. This one woman says, it's like living in a cage without a key. In a cage without a key. There's no way out. John Rady is a psychiatrist, Harvard psychiatrist and a brain researcher, and he describes depression as being a silencer of the soul. And then Rollo May, who I had the great fortune of studying under many years ago, and is one of the most famous of all psychiatrists, he calls it the inability to construct a future. Now, depression is essentially about sadness, ongoing and crippling sadness. It's that whole experience of just being down like this. There are 3 basic types of depression: dysthymia, which is a fancy word for ill-humored, reactive depression, and major or clinical depression. So let's look at each of these quickly. Dysthymia is people who have an innate tendency to emphasize the negative. They are by nature seemingly just negative. They see the negative side of life. Everything sort of is dark to them, that kind of thing. So they tend to be critical, glass half empty types, easily irritated, often referred to clinically as mild to moderate depression. Then we have reactive depression. And these are in terms of people who have suffered a significant loss in their life. The death of a loved one, loss of a job, divorce, health issue, anything like that. The third type is the one that causes the very significant problems. And it exhibits these symptoms on a recurrent basis: depressed mood most of the day, loss of interest in normal activities and relationships, fatigue or loss of energy almost every day, feelings of worthlessness, impaired concentration, insomnia, can't sleep, or hypersomnia, sleeping all the time. and markedly diminished pleasure in almost everything, and recurring thoughts of death or suicide, often the cause of suicides. Now, who's at risk? Major depression affects 10% of the U.S. population over age 18. But between 20 and 25% adults may suffer an episode of major depression at some point during their lifetime. Now, depression in men is significantly underreported. We men do not like to talk about our feelings, and particularly feelings that we think other people would look down upon us for. So men who suffer from clinical depression are less likely to seek help or even talk about their experience. What happens is that all their stuff, if you will, goes subterranean. They push it down, and it shows up in other forms then, sometimes volcanically, in shapes like anger, alcohol, drug abuse, violent behavior, both inwardly and outwardly, and addictions of all kinds. Now, what causes depression? We believe that there's a strong genetic factor. It runs through family systems, family of origin issues, things that went on in our families when we were young, domestic abuse, violence of any kind can cause depression. Being bullied, sexual abuse, trauma of one kind or another, which we will talk about at some length at a later point. Now, two things we know for certain about depression: it's real and it's vicious. It can cause very significant problems, ultimately suicide. Depression has to do with the malfunction of the brain. Remember before we've talked about how mental health problems, including addiction, are related to the brain. Now, 4 ways we treat depression: medication therapy through antidepressants, many of which have helped thousands and thousands of people. The discovery of antidepressants is one of the most noteworthy issues in the field of mental health. Psychotherapy, that's talk therapy, where you go to see an individual and talk through problems, that sort of thing. Then there's group therapy, where you have a whole group of people that can help you factor out some of these problems. And finally, lifestyle therapy. And let's look at each of these. Medication therapy, huge advances have been made in terms of the kind of medications and the effectiveness. Most medications are based on the belief that depression is caused by a lack of certain chemicals in the brain, so these antidepressants try to take care of that, lift that mood, that kind of thing. There are 3 basic types of medications. One are serotonin-based, the other one are a mix of serotonin and norepinephrine, and the final one, Wellbutrin, is a unique antidepressant that has to do with norepinephrine and dopamine. The purpose of the medication is to enhance the effectiveness of those chemicals already there in the brain. Psychotherapy, individual therapy, usually done in combination with medications that focus on connecting behavior problems or behavior patterns that you may not even be aware of, things that are going on in your lives that need to be named, identified, and so forth. Also help in developing new behavior patterns that affect the regulation of emotions and the development of interpersonal effectiveness skills. Group therapy and support groups. We have, in this day and age, many newer kinds of support groups like mindfulness and so forth, cognitive behavioral therapy, different types that are available to people for help, and I hope you'll make use of those if they're necessary. Finally, lifestyle therapy. Your diet, what you eat. Exercise. One psychiatrist says exercise is medicine. Yoga, mindfulness training, prayer and meditation. All of these can be very effective, and sometimes many of them are used together. Now, we go to anxiety. Now remember, depression is about sadness. It's that whole experience of just feeling down like this. Anxiety is about toxic worry and fear. So it's like, I'm short with breath, all that kind of stuff. Everything is just, has a fearful dimension to it. So toxic worry is a disease of the imagination. What that psychiatrist is saying is the brain just takes off on its own and imagines the very worst that could happen. And that's when, now we all have to worry about certain things, but we're talking here about toxic worry that just becomes overwhelming. And as it says here, anxiety is essentially about fear and excessive worry. Now there's generalized anxiety disorders. This is free-floating worry, no distinct object. I've got this worry, but I don't know what it's about. I don't know where to focus it, that kind of thing. And it's the anticipation of disaster when no real issue is apparent. The symptoms are I can't relax, I startle easily, difficulty concentrating, trouble falling asleep, and frequent headaches. Now, another one of the anxiety disorders are specific phobias and symptoms. And specific phobias refer to an intense irrational fear of something that really in reality poses no actual danger, like heights, going across bridges, flying, public speaking. Any of those can bring a tremendous sense of anxiety to people to the point that they simply can't do it. And the symptoms are the feared situation object brings on panic attacks or severe anxiety. Now, social phobia. Social phobia is an experience of becoming overwhelmingly self-conscious in everyday social situations. Like walking into a room with a lot of people. The fear is they're talking about me, they're going to laugh at me, this kind of stuff. I feel utterly inadequate. I knew one person who would have enormous headaches before having to go to a party, to a gathering of any kind. So it's an intense fear of being watched and judged. Symptoms are sweating, blushing, trembling, difficulty talking. Then we come to one that can be very severe and very, very serious. Panic attacks, panic disorder. Involves sudden attacks of terror, not just fear, but terror. And is usually accompanied by a pounding heart, faintness, dizziness, chest pains. The symptoms are the person feels like they're having a heart attack. It's that scary to them. And they're on the verge of death, even. They don't know when it will happen or what will happen or what the trigger is. Then we have obsessive compulsive disorder and symptoms, a very serious mental health problem that for years we had no answer to until the advent of antidepressant medications. They have helped significantly. That and learning strategies on the part of the person who has obsessive compulsive disorder has been able to help a lot of people. But this involves persistent upsetting obsessions and the use of rituals, compulsions like wash your hand, lock a door, that kind of stuff, to control the anxiety these thoughts produce. A very torturous experience for people. And symptoms are obsessive washing of hands, locking and unlocking doors, as I said, and checking and rechecking. How do we treat anxiety disorders? First of all, there's medication therapy. Benzodiazepines, very, very prominent and popular with a lot of people, Valium, Xanax, Klonopin. Please note, must be carefully used because of addiction potential. These can become addictive. And there's also a link to Alzheimer's, they claim, with them. So instead of benzodiazepines, highly recommend the use of antidepressants like Zoloft, Lexapro, and many others. Psychotherapy, also talk therapy, lifestyle therapy, diet, exercise, meditation, sleep, prayer, all of these. And treatment of attention deficit. Now, I started this whole session with talking about attention deficit disorder. Notice again, it comes up here because attention deficit disorder, if I have that busy brain that's constantly looking for something more exciting and interesting, it can cause anxiety and does cause anxiety with a lot of people. Now I want to talk to you about one of the most, if not the most, significant issue in terms of healing, the need for healing, and that has to do with trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, before I go any further, I want to give a brief history of how we came to understand what post-traumatic stress disorder is and to name it. And to do that, I have to go back like 100 years in Europe to the discussion of a man by the name of Sigmund Freud. When he got out of graduate school, he was a very brilliant man, but also a man who wanted a lot of applause and attention. So he was looking around for something that he could make a big hit with in terms of curing a significant problem. Now in Europe at that time, there was a very significant problem, and it had to do with women. You have to remember that at that time in Europe, men had total power over women and children. Women had no legal protections, and nor did children. So men had their way in just about everything. Now, what was happening to a lot of women at that time was that they were doing very eccentric, unusual behaviors, tearing their hair out, ripping their clothes up, gouging themselves, hurting themselves in one way or another, to the point that what they were doing with these women was putting them in jail-like places, and because they didn't know what else to do. Nobody knew what was causing this problem. So Freud volunteers to be the one who will solve this particular problem, and he makes a startling decision, one that would be startling to us anyway today, and that is he decided to go to these women and ask them what happened. No one had done that before. And so he spent some time doing that. The results then were published in a book. And this book is still a classic to this day. But what he discovered was that these women, to a person, were victims of severe abuse, domestic violence, sexual abuse, all kinds of hideous torture experiences, and so forth. So Freud then thought, boy, I've won a big victory here. I've solved this problem. We know what the answer is to why these women are acting this way. The problem was all the males in society in Europe, or at least a great majority of them, particularly scientists, turned against him because he was breaking the rule of men having power and not relinquishing that power. So what Freud then did was take his book off the market and never met with a female client again ever in his life. Now, advance from there to 70 years after that. The soldiers are coming back from that incredibly tragic war called Vietnam. And these soldiers did what no soldiers had ever done before. Most soldiers before would never talk about anything that went on there, but instead, these Vietnam soldiers started forming support groups and talking through the hideous experiences they had, the death, the violence, all of that mess that we call Vietnam. Now, at the same time in America, this was in the 1970s, women on their own were starting to form support groups. And they were talking about their life histories, not necessarily in Vietnam, but in their own domestic situations. And again, they named the abuse things of incest, sexual abuse, domestic violence, etc. Journalists began noticing that what was going on with the soldiers was very similar to what was happening to these women. And they began writing about that. The next thing, the legal profession decided that enough was enough. Women and children needed to have laws established to protect them. Finally, last of all, the American Psychiatric Association named this whole issue as post-traumatic stress disorder. It was 1980 when they did that. Now, the problem with trauma is once we got it named in 1980, but it took 20-some years before we knew how to treat it and how to take care of it. But trauma is one of the most significant issues in terms of understanding what goes on in our jail population, for example, and how constant addiction is a part of the lives of trauma victims. Listen to some statistics here. Rates of childhood trauma are notably elevated among incarcerated men. In the United States, 1 in 6 state inmates reported being physically or sexually abused before age 18, and many more witnessed interpersonal violence in their homes. Over half of male inmates reported experiencing childhood physical trauma. Emotional abuse, particularly abandonment, is also prevalent among incarcerated men. Childhood abuse also has been found to significantly predict arrests for alcohol or drug-related offenses. That is the problem we're faced with, and it's a huge one. So, what is trauma? What is psychological trauma? One of the best answers I found is one written by Judith Herman, who is a Harvard-trained psychiatrist who works with women who are abused, or traumatically abused. So she writes this: trauma is an affliction of the powerless. Think of that, an affliction of the powerless. At the moment of trauma, the victim is rendered helpless by overwhelming force. A human being is confronted with the extremities of helplessness and terror. They can't protect themselves. They are just overwhelmed by forces too powerful for them. So fear here, the rest of anxiety disorders are about fear and worry. Now technically, post-traumatic stress disorder is listed as an anxiety disorder, but I don't think that's accurate, because the other disorders are all about fear and excessive worry. Trauma is about something far different. It's about terror and being terrorized. A fear so intense that the person is rendered helpless, loses all control over their fate, and succumbs to a feeling of possible annihilation. Now, the other great expert in this country on post-traumatic stress disorder is Bessel van der Kolk, who was the primary psychiatrist that worked with the 9/11 victims. He writes this: post-traumatic stress disorder is the most misunderstood psychological disorder in recent medical history. It is also the most misdiagnosed and undertreated. Now, PTSD involves 4 major symptoms: hyperarousal, intrusion, constriction, and trauma bonding. Let's look at each of those quickly. Hyperarousal. The brain goes into a permanent state of alert. It's constantly looking for danger signals, as if danger might return at any moment. The traumatic events, listen to this, change the brain. The brain is different afterwards. They recondition the human nervous system. Intrusion. Long after the danger has passed, traumatized people relive the event as though it were continually recurring right now in the present. And consequently, traumatized people often reenact some aspects of the trauma scene in disguised form, most especially through dangerous, risk-taking behavior. An example, I had a woman as a client who told the story of her husband, who was a Vietnam vet. And she said that she was coming home from work one day, and the garage door to their house was completely open, and all these boxes were stacked up, and her husband was behind the boxes with his cane sticking through, making the sound of a machine gun going off. That's what they mean by reenactment. Constriction. The traumatized person can easily go into a state of surrender. Their system of self-defense shuts down entirely. They can't defend themselves, they feel. So alcohol, gambling, pornography, drugs, theft, cutting, etc. is used to obliterate their sense of helplessness and terror. I remember working with one prison inmate who had tattoos all over his body, literally. And I asked him what that was all about, and he said, every time I experience a trauma in my life, I got another tattoo. And he said that tattooing has involved with it a pain release factor, like cutting. And that's why he was almost addicted to the tattoos. Now, trauma bonding. This is one of the most, what is a word I want to use here, mysterious dimensions to post-traumatic stress disorder. It's also referred to as the Stockholm Syndrome, if you remember, where a bunch of bank robbers in Sweden robbed this bank, and they put this whole group of people, mostly women, in a part of the bank, vault, locked them in there, and left them there. Many of those women afterwards connected with their offenders who were caught and imprisoned, and fell in love with some of them and married some of them. So it's a bonding that takes place through the person's traumatic experience. And the traumatized person then bonds with the perpetrator because in their mind, it's the only remedy to their fear of annihilation. It's the only way they feel they can protect themselves. Now, how do we treat PTSD? I'm going to start with number 2 and go through and then come back to number 1 because it's the most important. Meditation, mindfulness, yoga, exercise, all of those are extremely important and helpful. Theater. What happens in theater is a person learns to play the role of another person, so they get out of their own persona and assume another one. And that seems to be helpful for many people. Journaling, group therapy, prayer, all of those are helpful. But the most effective treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder, to the point of the two psychiatrists that I just quoted, Bessel van der Kolk and Judith Thurman, claim a 60% better percentage rate of success in their trauma therapy work. It's called EMDR, standing for eye movement, desensitizing, and processing. I became certified in that area, and you need certification to do this. So if you're ever going to want to have this done by a therapist, make sure they can prove certifications for it. But EMDR is one you can easily look up. Just type in EMDR. It'll take you to their homepage and explain the whole process to you. It has nothing to do with hypnosis. It simply is a process that mimics the rapid eye movement REM sleep pattern, where your eyes are going like this back and forth in your brain, and your brain is going through a kind of healing process. And it's proven to be extremely effective. I had great success personally. However, what is required is the person who's undergoing EMDR has to go back to that experience and in effect relive that, and some people simply can't do that. It causes way too much disturbance for them. But for those who can, I've seen amazing things developed. I had one woman who came in, she was very forthright and blunt. She just sat down in my office and said, okay, here's the deal. My first marriage failed because I was abused as a child, and I'm going to marry again, and I don't want this happening again to me. This is, the problem I had. What can you do for me? So I told her about EMDR. I said, look it up, see if it's something you're interested in. She came back the next time, said, let's do it. We did this process 3 or 4 times. We made another appointment. She called me 2 days later and said, I will not need to come back. I've never felt so free in my entire life. This thing has been a marvel for me. And it can be for an awful lot of people. Now, quickly, I want to run through what are called personality disorders. These are maladaptive and enduring behavior patterns and thinking processes that deviate markedly from the expectations of society. They begin in adolescence or early childhood and lead to severe distress. These personality disorders are all rooted in the biology of the brain. Once again, we notice how the brain has so much power in terms of this process. Now, personality disorders, psychiatrists believe, are highly genetic. And each person's distinctive ways of experiencing and acting in the world represents the interaction between this genetic dimension to their life and life experiences. So genes determine tendencies. They don't determine the behavior, but the tendencies. And when those tendencies are affected by environmental forces, such as early childhood experiences in a person's home, neighborhood, school, or church, personality disorders can result. Narcissistic personality disorder is one that we talk a lot about these days. Oh, that person's a narcissist, everybody calling everybody a narcissist, all that sort of thing. But it's a very serious disorder in reality, and what it is a pervasive pattern of grandiosity, the need for constant admiration and a lack of empathy towards others. People with this disorder believe they are superior, special, and deserve to be treated as such. Borderline personality disorder, which is a pervasive pattern of instability in relationship. They experience intense abandonment fears and inappropriate fear. In fact, one of the most prominent books and popular books explaining borderline personality disorder is entitled, I Hate You, Don't Leave Me. I hate you, don't leave me. They are intolerant of being alone and have strong need to have other people with them at all times. Their abandonment fears may cause them to be involved in self-mutilating or suicidal behaviors, gambling, binge eating, and unsafe sex. They have consistent problems with extreme anger. Antisocial personality disorders, also referred to as sociopathic or psychopathic. which is a pervasive pattern of deceit and manipulation, which involves a repetitive and persistent violation of the basic rights of others. They repeatedly perform acts that are grounds for arrest, such as destroying property, stealing, pursuing illegal occupations. They are particularly notable for acting without any sense of remorse or regret. And finally, there are several more, but we'll end with this one, paranoid personality disorder, pervasive pattern of distrust and suspiciousness of others. Late-stage alcoholism is commonly portrayed as a time of paranoia for people. They're on the lookout, as you can see in this image that's shown here. Constantly suspicious, people are out to get them, going to find out about them, all that. They often feel they have been deeply injured by another person, and they're preoccupied with unjustified doubts about the loyalty or trustworthiness of their friends or associates. So, these are the mental health disorders. Once again, I want to appeal to you as strongly as I possibly can that if you truly want recovery, and I hope you do because you have a right to it and you deserve it, but please make sure if you have any of these mental health disorders, you get those taken care of with people who are properly certified. That, along with AA, will bring you a whole new kind of life, a whole new way of living that'll be free of so much baggage that has held you back and held you down. That is my wish for each and every one of you. Go for it. You have a right to it, and I hope you embrace it because you're worth it. God bless you.